The lecture takes its name from the Latin lectura, or reading. In the medieval university, books were hand-copied rarities. The professor's role was strictly logistical. They functioned as a human reading machine, dictating texts aloud so that students could transcribe their own copies. This evolved into the 20th century auditorium model. The sage on the stage took authority at the podium, broadcasting information to hundreds of seated students. Today, that broadcast model faces a reckoning. In an era where the sum of human knowledge is ubiquitous and searchable, the oral transmission of data is frequently criticized as a poor use of time for both the teacher and the student. Yet a contradiction exists. While lecture engagement falls, millions voluntarily consume 3-hour podcasts every day. This is cognitive friction, the biological resistance occurring when modern information delivery stalls out on evolutionary hardware that hasn't changed since the Pleistocene. Robert Gagne's 1965 instructional model provides a framework to resolve this friction. By treating his 9 events of instruction as a neurobiological blueprint, we can design a lecture that aligns with the way the brain is actually wired to receive information. The lecture format persists because it offers the opportunity for interpretation and inspiration, but it only succeeds when the delivery respects the physiological limits of Felicever. Much of the panic surrounding modern education relies on a 2015 corporate myth that human attention spans have dropped to 8 seconds, supposedly shorter than a goldfish. This figure has no basis in peer-reviewed science. Physiological research suggests that adult attention does not simply disappear. Instead, it pulsates, requiring a deliberate reset every 10 to 15 minutes as neurotransmitters are depleted and recharged. The gatekeeper of this cycle is the reticular activating system, or RAS, located in the brainstem. The RAS serves as the brain's sensory spam filter, scanning every sound and sight to decide what reaches the cortex for conscious thought and what is ignored to prevent cognitive overload. A predictable, monotonous lecture voice is quickly classified as noise. The RAS identifies the stimulus as safe and repetitive, effectively blocking the information from reaching the student's working memory. Bypassing this filter requires what neuroscientists call a prediction error, a sudden shock, a paradox, or a piece of deep novelty. This is the biological basis for Gagne's first event, gaining attention. You must prove to the RAS that the current environment has changed in an unpredictable way. Isaac Newton provided a literal example of this during his time as a professor at Cambridge. Because his lectures were famously difficult, students often failed to show up. Newton, a committed pedant, would deliver his full lectures to an entirely empty room, a historical absurdity that immediately disrupts a modern student's expectations. Beginning a session with dry, administrative overviews ensures the audience's RAS will block the high-value content that follows. After gaining attention, the process moves to the chemical engine of memory, dopamine. While often associated with pleasure, dopamine's primary role in the brain is encoding new information by signaling that a specific event is worth recording. This chemical release is governed by reward prediction error, or RPE, the gap between what the brain expects and what it actually experiences. When a student can perfectly predict a professor's next sentence, the RPE is 0. Dopamine levels remain flat, and the brain remains in a passive state, seeing no reason to update its internal model of the world. When the material is more surprising or engaging than expected, the resulting dopamine spike tags the hippocampus, physically instructing the brain to record the event. Humorous punchlines and well-timed stories work because they intentionally violate expectations. These microdoses of dopamine allow the brain to physically consolidate the facts associated with those moments. This is deepened by neural coupling. During a story, the listener's brain regions synchronize with the speaker's, creating a biological link that mirrors the speaker's own sensory and emotional experience. A lecture that fails to generate these prediction errors leaves the brain without the chemical signals required to build a physical memory. The modern professor faces a primary competitor for these dopamine spikes, the smartphone. These devices are engineered to provide the high-frequency RPE that a standard lecture cannot. We can view the impact of the phone through the lens of working memory capacity. Researcher Sophie Leroy identified a phenomenon called attention residue that occurs every time a student checks a notification. Even after the phone is put away, up to 40% of the student's working memory remains occupied by that unresolved notification. This leaves significantly less processing power available for the lecture. Because banning phones often creates an anxiety that drains working memory just as effectively, many educators now use tech pauses. These are brief, scheduled breaks that allow students to close their digital loops and return their full attention to the class. Protecting this limited capacity is essential for Gagné's fourth event, presenting the content. To avoid overloading the student, we use dual coding. When a professor reads text directly from a slide, the visual and auditory channels compete for the same linguistic processor. This bottleneck creates a cognitive block that prevents the student from absorbing either source of information. Effective lectures use visuals for imagery and the voice for explanation, ensuring these two channels complement one another rather than competing for the same narrow resources. Without intervention, the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve takes hold, with students losing up to 70% of a lecture's content within 24 hours. This decay is addressed by Gagné's 7th and 8th events, feedback and assessment. High-stakes testing often triggers a flood of cortisol. This stress hormone can actively suppress the hippocampus, making it physically harder for students to retrieve the very information they are being tested on. Frequent, low-stakes quizzes and active polling avoid this stress response. They force the brain into active retrieval, which triggers long-term potentiation, the physical strengthening of the synapses where knowledge is stored. Regular assessment serves as a biological trigger to reinforce these neural connections, while the information is still fresh. Combined, Gagné's 9 events function as a technical schematic for managing the human brain's resources. The sequence is clear: bypass the RAS with novelty, manage working memory's bottleneck, and use retrieval practice to signal the hippocampus to lock in data. In a world of universal data access, the educator is no longer a simple storage device. The modern educator's role is an architect, designing an environment that triggers the biological sequence required for students to reach genuine insight. The lecture has transitioned from a simple broadcast of information into a designed experience that actively reshapes the neural architecture of the student.